Okay, let's unpack this. You've come to us with a really rich set of sources, notes, articles, research charting, a truly fascinating, incredibly complex, and, well, often turbulent journey.
Definitely turbulent. We're
Oh.
talking about Nepal's shift, right?
Mm-hmm.
From centuries of monarchy to becoming a, well, still nascent and frankly, struggling republic.
Exactly. And this isn't just a dry history lesson from your material. It paints a vivid picture, you know?
Yeah.
This persistent struggle between that centralized power, held so tightly by elites for generations.
And the deep, enduring yearning among the Nepali people for genuine representation, for a real voice in their own governance. That comes through so strongly.
And woven through that is the immense challenge, clearly highlighted in your sources, of trying to build functional democratic institutions pretty much from scratch, especially in a place burdened by such a deep authoritarian past.
Yeah, and your sources really highlight that this transition hasn't been smooth sailing. It's been a constant, sometimes wearying dance between these moments of incredible hope and then periods of profound disillusionment and these ever-present calls for fundamental change. It's a cycle.
Absolutely. So our mission with this deep dive is to take this stack of material you've provided and really extract the most vital nuggets, the key insights. We want to navigate this complex history and the very real present-day reality it's shaped, helping you understand the absolutely key turning point.
The persistent challenges that seem to keep cropping up, tripping things up.
Exactly. And the underlying political and societal dynamics that are shaping Nepal's future right now. What's really going on beneath the surface?
It's about identifying those core forces at play, isn't it? This sheer weight of that long historical context, you can't ignore it.
Yep.
The specific moments where the path really shifted dramatically, and then the rise of these new challenges like the chronic instability and corruption that, well, your sources suggest seem almost baked into the new system now.
And even some surprising undercurrents, like that resurfacing pro-monarchy movement. Your material details quite extensively. We need to look at that too.
Definitely. Because understanding Nepal's journey isn't just about Nepal, is it? It offers really critical insights into the broader challenges so many nations face globally.
That's a great point. Trying to build stable, inclusive, genuinely democratic systems after long periods of, well, non-representative rule. It's a universal struggle in many ways.
It's a story of remarkable resilience, for sure, but also ongoing struggle. And, as your material makes abundantly clear, a revolution that decades later still feels very much unfinished.
Unfinished, that's a good way to put it. So let's jump in. Let's see what your sources reveal about where it all started.
Okay. To truly grasp the current state of affairs, we absolutely have to start with the deep past. Nepal's political landscape, it's profoundly shaped by millennia of dynastic rule.
Right, you just can't understand the present without acknowledging the immense weight of that history. Your sources go way back, talking about the early Malala and Shah monarchies, periods defined by an almost unimaginable concentration of power.
Absolutely. Kings and this tiny circle of favored nobles, they held absolute sway for centuries. It wasn't just political power, it was social, economic, everything.
And even when there was a break from direct monarchical control, it wasn't exactly a shift towards popular sovereignty, was it?
Not at all. Your sources mentioned the Rana oligarchy. They seized power, set up this hereditary prime ministership in the mid-19th century.
So another form of centralized, unaccountable rule.
Exactly. Power passed down through one family. The king became basically a figurehead, while the Ranas ran the country almost like a private estate. That only ended with the 1950 revolution.
And 1950, on paper, sounds like this clear victory for democratic forces, overthrowing the Ranas.
It seemed like it. But your sources show that even then, genuine democracy was incredibly fleeting. The monarchy, the Shah dynasty, they didn't step back. They reasserted themselves as supreme.
So what followed was this really unstable period, sort of alternating between the king holding almost absolute power and these brief, often controlled periods of parliamentary administration.
Precisely. A profoundly unsettled, dualistic system of governance. And your material really zeroes in on this as creating a deep, almost inherent political torment for the Nepali people.
How so?
Well, there was this underlying persistent yearning for genuine representation. For a political system where citizens actually had a meaningful say in how their lives were governed. A stark contrast to centuries of just being ruled by others.
But here's where your sources introduce a critical nuance, something often overlooked. Despite that deep yearning for representation, the material points out that the societal structures themselves were, well, largely unready for full, immediate democratization at that time.
That's a really key analytical point from your sources. They explain why. Centuries of autocratic rule, it left a legacy of suppression. People were used to obedience, not participation.
Then things like literacy.
Widespread limited literacy, exactly, making it hard for people to access information, engage in informed debate. Plus, restricted communication networks, especially outside the Kathmandu Valley.
So people in rural areas were often isolated, not really equipped to claim democratic power, even if the structures were nominally there.
Right. It wasn't just about changing the system at the top. The foundation itself needed rebuilding. People weren't prepared to meaningfully claim and wield that power yet.
Precisely. And the direct outcome of this early struggle, this clash between the yearning and the unpreparedness, was the rise of what your source calls hybrid systems.
Hybrid systems, what does that mean in practice?
It meant the powerful elites, the ones who'd always held power, they just found ways to continue their dominance. They operated under new, often superficial, democratic labels.
Ah, so it looked democratic on the surface, but it could still be manipulated by the old guard.
Pretty much. The structures might look different, but the same people were often pulling the strings. And this dynamic, this adaptation of old power, really sets the stage for the cycles of frustration and disillusionment we see later on in your sources.
Okay, which brings us to a truly significant turning point. That initial promise of democracy back in '51 had definitely faltered. Kings staged coups, autocratic rule came back.
Yeah, was working.
But that situation couldn't hold forever. The pressure built up, and finally, you get the 1990 People's Movement Jana Andolan of the March.
This was huge, right? It didn't get rid of the monarchy entirely, but it fundamentally changed its nature.
Absolutely monumental. The absolute monarchy was forced to concede power, gave way to a constitutional monarchy, and crucially, this movement embedded multi-party democracy directly into a new constitution in 1990.
So democratic principles actually written into the foundational law, not just
Yeah.
a temporary arrangement.
Exactly. And you immediately saw this flowering of political pluralism that had been suppressed. Major parties we still see today emerged or reemerged. Nepali Congress, the Communist Party of Nepal, especially the UML faction.
CP and UML, right.
Yeah.
And there was also a move towards more local governance,
Right.
trying to push power down.
Yes, a significant move towards more participatory local governance, trying to get decisions and resources closer to people at the village and district level. At least that was the idea.
Yet, your sources are quick to pivot here. Despite this democratic dawn, this embedding of multi-partyism, the deep roots of instability persisted.
They really did. What did that look like? Your sources mention remarkably shifting governments, prime ministers, cabinets lasting only a short time,
Constant churn.
constant churn, weak party infrastructure too. Parties often driven by personalities, not strong institutions, and already widespread endemic corruption starting to eat away at any trust in these new democratic institutions.
So the core problem, as your sources analyze it, was that this nascent democracy functioned more in theory than in practice. Why was that?
Well, the compelling answer they provide is that the powerful elites, many from those old hybrid systems, continued to control the flow of capital, the flow of policy decisions behind the scenes.
So the formal rules changed, but the real levers of tower money connections stayed concentrated.
Exactly, in a few hands. And while electoral politics brought new avenues for hope and participation, it also, perhaps inevitably, introduced new kinds of political maneuvering, manipulation.
And your sources distinguished this manipulation, right? It wasn't really about big ideological battles for the nation's future.
Not primarily. It was mostly centered on incredibly narrow personal interests, or the interests of specific ethnic or caste groups, vying for power, for resources, for positions, not about a comprehensive national vision.
That's a crucial distinction your material highlights. Democracy is a battle for patronage, not ideas.
Pretty much. And this led to a growing disconnect. Political awareness did increase significantly. People knew more about parties, leaders, processes.
Or real power.
Still stubbornly concentrated among Kathmandu-based elites and their networks, deepening that existing divide with rural, marginalized Nepal, setting up more frustration, more potential conflict down the line.
And that deepening divide, plus the growing disillusionment with how democracy was working or not working, and widening inequality, especially in the late 90s, that created fertile ground for something much more destructive.
Tragically fertile, yeah. Those underlying tensions that had been simmering for decades, land ownership issues, so central to rural life.
Persistent, often brutal caste divisions.
Unresolved regional political grievances.
Yeah.
All these tensions just flourished in this environment of superficial democracy and perceived elite capture.
And critically, your sources explain how these deep-felt tensions were exploited by Maoist insurgents, launching a decade-long civil war in 1996.
Their stated goals, initially at least, were radical transformation, framed explicitly as class struggle overthrowing the old order, establishing a people's republic.
But your sources highlight that the war quickly became something broader, symbolically, for many Nepalese.
It really did. It evolved into this powerful, though incredibly violent, rebellion against centuries of fundamental exclusion. Geographical exclusion for remote areas, social exclusion based on caste and ethnicity, economic exclusion, leaving so many in poverty.
The insurgency became a vehicle for grievances the democratic system had failed to address.
And it's important to acknowledge, as your sources do, that while the insurgents' methods were horrific and caused immense suffering,
Terrible cost.
they undeniably succeeded in highlighting the chronic neglect faced by remote and marginalized communities. They forced the country and the world to pay attention, albeit through awful means.
And the cost. Just devastating. Your sources put the death toll at over 17,000 people. Infrastructure destroyed, development stalled completely. Nepal brought, as your material starkly says, to the precipice of collapse.
The state's capacity was just gutted. The war finally ended with the 2006 Comprehensive Peace Accord. Maoists, government, major parties involved.
A huge moment. It didn't just end the fighting, it fundamentally rewrote Nepal's political future, paved the way for abolishing the monarchy, establishing the republic. A chance to start anew.
Absolutely. Charged with immense possibility. But your sources note an almost immediate, perhaps unintended, consequence.
Which was?
Instead of stable nation building, the accord and the transition that followed inaugurated a new cycle of fragile coalitions and shifting allegiances. This pattern of instability became the defining feature of the Republic era.
So peace didn't bring stability in that sense.
Not political stability, no. And the echoes of the conflict itself, the trauma, unresolved issues for victims, former combatants, justice, reconciliation, all that continues to influence governance and politics today. The work of healing is far from complete.
Which brings us to the formal declaration, the aspiration of so many for decades. Abolishing the 240-year-old monarchy in 2008.
Nepal formally declared a secular federal republic. On paper, the ultimate realization of that long-held dream for democratic sovereignty.
Sounds like the revolution finally complete, right? But your sources immediately introduced the stark reality that followed. Establishing stable governance proved elusive.
Elusive is putting it mildly. The period from 2008 onwards is just characterized by this incredible level of political churn, instability, deeply damaging.
Governments became transient, leaders changing frequently, sometimes just months apart, alliances collapsing.
Constantly. And the root cause, as your sources diagnose it, wasn't robust debate over policy or ideology. It was primarily driven by power tussles among the major parties. Nepali Congress, CPN-UML, the Mal Center Party, regional parties, all vying for influence.
Just constant competition for control of the executive, leading to coalitional uncertainty and paralysis.
Exactly. And this is where your sources identify that concerning trend accelerating. Ideologies soon gave way almost entirely to personal ambition, the pursuit of position.
The material is clear on this, right? Alliances weren't about shared policy goals. They formed and dissolved explicitly over who gets which ministerial portfolio.
That became the central question. Not what they would do, but who gets what ministry. And you saw the political landscape fragment even further because of this.
Like the proliferation of communist factions. Dozens of different Marxist or former Maoist groups.
Yeah, and your sources suggest this wasn't always deep theoretical disagreement. It reflected this breakdown into smaller, often personality-driven or interest-driven groups, each vying for a piece of power.
And the consequence? Predictable and corrosive. Politicians trading principle for position. Public cynicism deepening profoundly.
Your sources use powerful language here. The very idea of a people-powered democracy seemed to rot under the weight of opportunism and betrayal.
That captures the feeling, doesn't it? The disappointment, the promises of the republic dissolving into endless squabbling, weakening democratic faith.
Massively weakening it. And amidst all this instability, the new republic still had to implement massive reforms. Federalism, writing a new constitution, establishing secularism.
Right, the Constituent Assembly. That was a moment of immense hope, wasn't it? Tasked with writing the new constitution, heralding hopes of inclusion for marginalized groups.
Huge hopes. Your sources list the groups campaigning hard for meaningful representation. Tharu, Madhisi, Dalits, women, numerous ethnic communities. Finally, a chance to be heard.
But the process itself. Elites stumbled over contentious issues, federal divisions, contentious clauses.
Lines hardened, as your sources put it, making it incredibly difficult to reach broad consensus. Factions dug in.
And the result was the 2015 Constitution being promulgated not in unity, but after prolonged, bitter debate and tragically violent protests, particularly in the Madras region.
Exactly. Where groups felt their concerns about representation and federal boundaries just hadn't been addressed properly. A very difficult birth for the new Constitution.
And the Constitution itself, ambitious, yes, trying to embody federalism, secularism, republicanism, but it wasn't free from criticism from day one.
No, and the criticisms raised in your material were significant. People pointed to the rushed finalization after the 2015 earthquake, the lack of broader consensus. The protests proved that.
And perceived centralist tendencies, even within the so-called federal setup.
Right. The promise was decentralization, but critics felt significant power and resources remained stubbornly in Kathmandu.
And the lasting impact of this rushed, contentious process, especially excluding some voices.
It reinforced that lingering idea for many Nepalese power, even without a king, still resided with a select few elites and their networks, leading to lasting grievances, groups feeling sidelined within the new republic.
Okay. And on top of that sense of exclusion, the infighting, the struggles with federalism, another major problem became deeply endemic in the republic, further eroding public faith. Corruption.
Endemic is the word your sources use, and not just low-level stuff. They highlight significant systemic examples. Large-scale tax stamp frauds, major cooperative banking scams hitting ordinary people.
Illicit land deals involving powerful figures. Politicians, bureaucrats, frequently under suspicion.
Often backed by credible reports. Nepal does have anti-graft bodies like the CIAA. They've been active, investigating, filing charges. But, your sources note, inconsistent prosecutions. Cases drag on. Powerful people seem to evade conviction. Judgments get watered down. It did little to genuinely deter the deeply ingrained patronage politics fueling the corruption.
So for many Nepalists, the public perception became clear. Politics equals profiteering.
Sadly, yes. Not public service, but a route to personal wealth and power through illicit means. And this highlights that stark disconnect between constitutional ideals and ground reality.
Rights and liberties legally protected, but the day-to-day experience. Transparency often just a facade.
Easily bypassed by those with connections. And the legal system itself became part of the problem. Your sources describe legal proceedings dragging on for years, decades sometimes.
And even when judgments came in corruption cases, they were often watered down, buried in loopholes, especially against the powerful.
Rendering them ineffective, yeah. The consequence. Widespread impunity. The powerful seemed immune. This discouraged honest administration demoralized good officials and perversely emboldened corruption to become even more blatant.
What about the media? They're known for being quite vocal in Nepal.
They are relatively free compared to many neighbors, but not without challenges. Your sources mention subtle political pressures, withdrawal of state advertising, legal harassment against journalists trying to expose wrongdoing.
So investigative journalism thrives because the problems are visible, but it's constantly under threat.
That's the picture your sources paint. So you have this potent mix. Political instability, exclusion, pervasive, untouchable corruption. It's maybe not surprising your sources connect all this to a broader trend. Democratic fatigue.
Democratic fatigue, that really captures it. So much hope after the struggle. But the reality of constant government collapses, policy reversals, lack of basic service delivery, it eroded faith in the mainstream Democratic parties.
Deeply eroded it. And this widespread disenchantment, this weariness, has fueled something quite significant and, for many, surprising. The resurgence of pro-monarchy movements.
This is striking in your sources, especially since late 2023. Tens of thousands marching. Demanding what, specifically?
Two main things. The return of the king and restoring Nepal as a Hindu state, the status it had before becoming secular in 2008.
And you see them in public squares, not just Kathmandu, but provincial towns, too, with monarchist slogans, portraits, cultural symbols.
Exactly. And the demographics are interesting. Your sources describe a mix. Older generation nostalgic for perceived stability.
Joining hands with young, often unemployed youth who see democracy as a failed experiment it hasn't delivered for them.
Precisely. And that's key to the narrative being pushed. The monarchy, once seen as oppressive, is now being rebranded by proponents as a potential stabilizing force, a symbol of unity compared to the current perceived chaos.
Weaponizing religious sentiment and cultural nostalgia in these campaigns?
Explicitly, tapping into that public frustration. And despite government bans or restrictions, the movement persists, gains visibility. Your sources mention the Joint People's Movement Committee, formed March 2025, demanding constitutional amendments.
And the Rastriya Prajatantra Party, the RPP, leading the political push.
Within Parliament, yes, but joined by this broad, unlikely network. Hindu groups, former royal loyalists, and even disillusioned former communist cadres. People who once fought the monarchy now see it as an alternative.
That's fascinating. How has the government responded?
Varied, often reactive. Curfews, bans, judicial threats against activists.
And this tension boiled over recently. Late March 2025 clashes in Kathmandu.
Yes, highlighted in your material. Protesters marching for the monarchy clashed with police.
And video spread rapidly on social media, showing baton charges, tear gas.
Incredibly quickly. It wasn't just a local incident. It galvanized sentiment, especially among sympathizers, and deepened polarization.
How did the politicians react?
Government tried to downplay it, frame it as a public order issue. Yeah. But the opposition, civil society, they capitalized, demanded accountability, called it a symptom of wider democratic decay, government failure.
So these movements, the reactions, they indicate a volatile, significant undercurrent, not just fringe noise. It represents real frustration, fundamental questioning of the republic's direction.
Absolutely. And within this turbulence, your sources also highlight key political figures. K.P. Sharma Oli is mentioned prominently.
Yes, veteran communist politician, but maybe more famous recently as Nepal's most frequent prime minister in the Republic era.
Right. And your material analyzes his latest terms as reflecting that deeply transactional nature of Nepali politics we discussed, forming coalitions with unlikely partners.
Alliances driven by tactical necessity, power-sharing deals rather than ideology.
Often, yes. And his political style. A blend of populist rhetoric appealing to the people and strong nationalistic posturing. He knows how to influence discourse, consolidate his base.
His communication style is noted too. Bravado, historical references, presenting himself as a strong leader, defender of sovereignty.
Very much so, especially navigating relations with India and China, that difficult balancing act.
But significant criticisms too. Under his leadership, democratic institutions arguably weakened. Executive amassed disproportionate power.
That's the critique your sources present. Controversial decisions, too, ordinances, attempts to dissolve parliament, face legal challenges. His legacy, as your sources say, will be debated for years.
Okay. Shifting slightly, but staying with governance challenges. Your sources highlight a recent sectoral issue, the April 2025 education sector protest.
Yes, a key example. The Nepal Teachers Federation mobilized nationwide against the school education bill.
Why? What were their arguments?
They argued the bill undermined job security and centralized control too much, reduced local and teacher autonomy.
And it wasn't just teachers. Students, civil society joined in. Strikes brought schools to a standstill.
Broad participation, yeah. Flooded streets, placards, slogans. Schools shut down nationwide for nearly a month. It was major disruption.
How was it resolved?
An agreement was finally reached. Interestingly, your sources note a new minister was appointed, seemingly to reset dialogue.
But what did the episode expose, according to your sources?
Deeper governance gaps in crucial public sectors, and that lingering top-down approach to policymaking. Stakeholders, like teachers, often ignored until a crisis forces the government's hand.
So, temporarily calmed, but underlying frustrations remain, indicating a need for structural reform in how policy is made.
Exactly. Need for more genuine consultation, less top-down imposition in vital sectors like education.
Now, all these political struggles, institutional challenges, they're framed by Nepal's underlying economic realities.
Crucially so. And the most striking economic factor in your sources, heavy reliance on remittances.
Money from migrant workers abroad makes up a huge chunk of GDP, right? Millions working in the Gulf, Southeast Asia, sending money home.
An absolutely significant portion. And it's a classic double-edged sword, as your sources identify.
Strength and vulnerability.
Exactly. Strength. Vital inflow of foreign currency, cash for families helps reserves. Vulnerability. Signals domestic failure to create jobs, retain talent. Symptom of weak economic growth at home.
Your sources mention the latest budget, prioritizing infrastructure, employment, entrepreneurship, familiar goals.
Very familiar. But skepticism remains about implementation. Critics argue allocations are often political tools rewarding constituencies, funding pet projects, not strategic deployment for real development needs.
Meanwhile, basic issues like inflation, cost of living, hurting average citizens, fueling political anger.
Definitely, making people more receptive to anti-establishment narratives. Ultimately, achieving economic justice, inclusive growth. That remains an elusive goal for the Republic.
Add to this domestic picture Nepal's equally complex geopolitical situation. landlocked between India and China.
Two massive, rising, powerful neighbors, which means Nepal has to constantly walk that diplomatic tightrope, as your sources put it, a delicate, continuous balancing act.
Relations with India, historically strong, open border, culture, trade, but also strained sometimes. Border disputes, perceived meddling.
Always complex. Meanwhile, China's influence is growing rapidly, increasingly visible. Big infrastructure investments, roads, airports, hydropower, plus active political lobbying.
So Nepal's strategy is trying to benefit from both without falling under the shadow of either.
That seems to be the attempt, leveraging investment from both. They also maintain ties with the West US, EU, focusing on aid, education, governance reforms.
But a concern highlighted is that Nepal's foreign policy sometimes lacks a coherent doctrine, driven more by ad hocism than strategy, reacting rather than planning.
That's the criticism. And looking ahead, as global tensions rise, especially in Asia, Nepal's neutral position might come under pressure, could force difficult choices.
So the concluding thought is foreign policy needs to be more proactive, strategic, not just reactive.
That seems to be the takeaway from your material on that front.
Okay, circling back to one of the major reforms, federalism. Your sources emphasize it's far from complete, still a work in progress with big challenges.
Absolutely key point. Implementing federalism has brought its own struggles. The 7 provinces grapple with limited real autonomy, unclear fiscal mechanisms, confusing bureaucratic overlap between federal, provincial, local levels.
So the Constitution envisions strong provinces, but reality is still more centralized. Kathmandu still holds the cards.
Largely, yes, according to your sources, leading to frequent disputes over revenue sharing, administrative control, appointments. Provincial leaders often complain they feel like ceremonial figures.
Any bright spots in the federal structure?
Where your sources do point out, local governments, municipalities have shown some promise, especially delivering basic services, health, education, disaster response, sometimes more effective than higher levels.
But even locally, issues remain. Capacity gaps, limited resources, political interference.
Yes, those problems persist even at the local level. So federalism in Nepal, still very much a work in progress, full of contradictions and contested interpretations.
What does it need to work better, according to your sources?
Genuine political will for decentralization, more maturity among leaders to collaborate, not just compete, and clearer constitutional and legal frameworks on resources and authority.
Okay. But amidst all these challenges, instability, corruption, federalism struggles, your sources point to a vital positive force, civil society.
Absolutely. Perhaps the most hopeful element. Civil society continues to play a crucial, often indispensable role. Various groups, professionals, students, rights advocates, environmentalists, ethnic groups, frequently mobilize, voicing concerns, holding power accountable.
The media, too, despite pressures, remains relatively vibrant, investigative.
Yes, pushing boundaries, exposing wrongdoing, trying to inform the public. Social media platforms have also become significant arenas for debate, satire, mobilization.
And dynamic youth-led campaigns, tackling corruption, environment, gender violence, gaining traction outside traditional party structures.
Definitely bringing new energy. Legal activism is rising to public interest litigations, challenging government decisions, shaping policy through the courts.
And the courts themselves. Though criticized for delays, they have occasionally risen to defend constitutional values, acting as a check on power.
Sometimes, yes. So, taken together, these civic energies suggest something important. Despite the malaise at the top, democratic culture at the grassroots is maturing, finding ways to demand change.
Non-governmental actors trying to fill the governance vacuums left by the struggling political establishment.
Slowly but surely, yeah. That's a key trend your sources identify.
So, looking at everything we've unpacked from your sources, the deep history, the turbulent transitions, instability, corruption, federalism challenges, the pro-monarchy resurgence, Nepal clearly stands at a critical crossroads.
Absolutely critical. The Republican project, that democratic dream, is being severely tested by corruption, instability, and that regressive nostalgia, the pull of the past.
Economically, promise in tourism, hydropower, but growth is uneven, exclusionary. Many not seeing benefits.
Leaving them vulnerable, frustrated. Social inclusion, constitutionally enshrined, remains patchy in practice. Significant groups still feel marginalized.
And then there's the youth. Better educated, globally connected, demanding more than slogans, seeking real opportunities, justice, dignity.
They want the republic to actually deliver a better life. And there's a real danger here. If mainstream parties fail to evolve, fail to address grievances, fail to deliver,
new political forces might fill the vacuum. monarchists, populists, technocrats.
Could be. And the danger isn't just change. It's potential regression, moving backwards from democratic gains, not forwards.
Yet, as your sources strongly remind us, Nepal has shown remarkable resilience before. War to peace, monarchy to republic, constantly reinventing itself.
That history of resilience is undeniable. So the central question, the one for you, the listener, to consider is, will this resilience be enough this time? Enough to weather the current crisis?
Because the future hinges on key factors, right?
Yeah.
Leadership quality prioritizing national interest, genuine institutional reform tackling corruption, decentralizing power, and civic engagement citizens demanding accountability.
Absolutely. A mature democracy needs more than symbols. It needs credible elections people trust, transparent governance, an independent judiciary for everyone, and responsive public services that actually work.
Your sources point to potential agents of change. Emerging platforms, women, youth activists, rights advocates, could they reshape the agenda?
They could, but the obstacle is huge. Those entrenched patronage networks resisting change. They won't give up power easily.
The fundamental requirement, though, for any republic to survive, citizens must see tangible dividends, feel their lives are improving, opportunity, justice, fairness.
Otherwise, if the republic keeps failing them, seen as corrupt and chaotic, those symbols of lost dynasties, calls for the past, they become more appealing.
A seemingly preferable alternative to current frustration.
Exactly. Nepal's story, as your sources make abundantly clear, is far from over.
The next decade feels pivotal. Will the dream of a federal, inclusive, prosperous, stable republic finally be realized after centuries of searching, or remain an unfinished revolution?
Constantly battling the ghosts of its past, grappling with the failures of its present.
The ultimate determinant in writing that next chapter, it won't be just the politicians, it will be the will of the Nepali people themselves, shaped by their pain, their memory, their aspirations. What do you think that next chapter will hold?